Why do I suck at making chapatis? In the last episode, I realized that chapatis aren't that easy to make. As a refresher, I'm talking about Swahili chapatis, or parathas, which differs from Indian chapati by layering fat in between the dough to create a deliciously layered flatbread. So why do I suck at making chapati? Let's get lost. There are 3,492 ways to make a chapati, and I'm trying to combine all of them. I'm trying to add too many ingredients in the beginning and mix too many techniques in the middle before I even understand what I'm working with. I need to simplify things, so I'm going to stick to a basic guideline until I can figure this thing out. First, I'm going to standardize all my ingredients and get rid of the fluff. Flour. Atta is the gold standard for flour, but I don't have that here in Oaxaca, so I'm going to use a mix of white and whole wheat flours. Most people in Tanzania are using all-purpose flour, so that works just fine. Salt and sugar are next. Now, I'm not measuring and I have no standard amount I'm gonna add, but after everything's mixed together, I like to taste the dough and see if I've added enough salt or sugar. I don't want a chapati that's too salty or too sweet, but a nice balance. After that, I'm gonna add oil. Wait, what's the oil doing in the chapati anyways?
So the reason we add fats is that it actually prevents gluten formation.
That's Ashok, author of the greatest book of all time, Masala Lab, the science of Indian cooking.
So fats actually kind of get in the way of water by causing these proteins to bind. But what happens is that it creates shorter and shorter gluten strands. The more fat you add, the shorter the gluten strands. In fact, this is the reason why fat is called shortening, and why biscuits are called shortbread in the UK, right? And you want this in things like, say, biscuits to the extreme level because you do not want any chewiness. You want crispness.
So let's pretend this Oaxacan cheese is a gluten strand. It's chewy, it's stretchy, but if we add oil to it before the gluten is allowed to form, it becomes shorter and in turn softer and easier to chew.
I like my rotis to have a little bit of chewiness, and so I will often avoid adding oil if I'm making like chapatis and so on. But some people like it to just sort of break apart in the hand, be ultra soft and just flaky and tear apart easily. And so you want to add oil, and you want to add it before you add the water, because then once you add the water and the dough hydrates, the gluten starts forming. The idea is to add the oil and get the oil to sort of interact with as much of the wheat as possible to get that sort of coarse, crumbly texture before you then introduce the water. By that time, the fat's done its job. It will then prevent the gluten formation. Gluten formation happens only when you add the water.
I want a soft chapati that's easy to tear up and soak up sauce, rather than a burrito wrap type of structure that needs to hold everything together. So I'm gonna go with a healthy amount of oil. I found that if my mix starts to feel like crumbly shortbread, I've gone too far and I need to add back a little more flour. After incorporating the oil into the flour, it's time for our final ingredient, water. But to be honest, I have a bit of a water problem. I have no idea how much water I'm supposed to add to the mix. Can't you just follow a recipe or something? Like measure it and stuff? Cups?
The freshness of the flour also determines how much water it will absorb. The grinding size, how coarse it is versus how fine it is, will also determine how much water it will absorb. The amount of fiber will also, the more fibrous the flour, the more water it will absorb, and so on.
So how much water should I add, and what should I be looking for when it comes to adding water?
So you want to go add as much as water as you possibly can, without it becoming too sticky. It's sort of like a curve where you want to hit one kind of optimal maximum. Then after that, it either becomes too painful and inconvenient to bake, and so on, right? And you want to hit that maximum, largely again because you get the softest product, because you are hydrating more of the dough, so you are getting a softer product overall. The other this thing is that it's going to stay softer for a longer time after you cook. So one of the things with if your chapati is made from a relatively slightly drier dough, what will happen is that it's okay if it's fresh and hot off the tawa, but a few minutes later, the starch is going to retrograde and you'll be left with like something that sort of more like papad, right? So you do want to leave behind a fair amount of water inside, while you cook the chapati, so that it takes a longer time for it to evaporate and for the starches to retrograde and become sort of dry.
What I found worked really well for me was to add water slowly, mix it around, and repeat until I have a slightly sticky dough in the bowl. Not too sticky, but not dry enough that it's not sticking at all. And if I went too far and added too much water, which sadly happened often, all I had to do was add flour bit by bit to get me back to that perfect texture. If you're the type of person who needs to measure things out,
I do say that you want to start off with maybe 70-80%, and then work your way up to as high as possible. And depending on the kind of flour you have, and also your taste preferences, and as well, right? Some people don't like it ultra soft as well. So that's really all there is to it.
but wait, that's not the only water problem I have. What about water temperature?
Right. So water temperature essentially is that in general, most biochemical reactions of all kinds tend to occur ideally at room temperature. And again, obviously, vary that the definition of room temperature may vary depending on whether you're living in India or whether you're living in the Nordics. But in general, for wheat at least, 20 to 30 Celsius sort of is typically the temperature at which all reactions happen at an optimal pace, right? And so essentially, and that includes everything from proteins binding with water and gluten forming, all of these other things. So in general, room temperature or sometimes even lukewarm water can actually help. But too hot of a water will end up cooking the starch part of the wheat. And then that gives you a different texture. It sort of gives you a very doughy texture to your roti as well. You do not want the starch to gelatinize fully before you actually cook the chapatis, right? So the wheat is just maybe 12 to 15% protein. All the rest is just starch. And then the hotter the water, the more likely that the starch will start to gelatinize, which means that it sort of becomes a thick, gooey thing, right? So too cold, and I think it impairs your ability to form gluten strands and so on. I think a room temperature water is just ideal.
I do like my chapati a little doughy, but for the sake of not sucking, I'm going to stick to warm water instead of the nearly boiling water I was using before. So what else does this recipe need? Get it? Need? Because that's the next step. Roll the slide. Holy shit, I suck at kneading. I've never worked with dough before, so I had no concept of how to deal with it. I was being too rough trying to beat it into submission, ripping it apart, getting my hands lost in the dough. It felt like I was getting swallowed alive, and trust me, it is super frustrating. I would literally have chapati nightmares.
No chapatis. No.
But once I figured out what I wanted my dough to feel like before kneading, the kneading process became a lot easier. My favorite kneading method right now is from Chef Raphael on YouTube. This method doesn't use any flour on the kneading surface, and it allows me to be really gentle with the dough, which I like because I can be too heavy-handed sometimes. It produces a nice, soft, fluffy dough, which is really nice compared to the dense brick I was getting before. There are plenty of methods out there. This is just the one I'm sticking with to make this type of chapati. But I did notice something really interesting. When I did a test of 3 different doughs, one not kneaded at all, another kneaded lightly, and a third one kneaded to what I thought was right where it needed to be, I found something really interesting. I didn't need to knead the dough at all, as long as the water was right and I let it rest for long enough.
So what people don't realize is the fact that since you are damaging a fair bit of the gluten, you actually don't need to knead for the most part, right? You don't need to knead heavily at all, right? You do need to knead if you're making like bread, because you do want a super strong, thick, gluten layer outside so that it traps all of the air. You don't want that in a chapati. You actually don't want chewiness in general, right? So in general, kneading for a chapati is entirely optional, but again, it's just that people have got used to that, and then so they're used to making sure that it gets fully hydrated. Just knead enough to make sure that it's uniformly hydrated.
I personally really enjoy the act of kneading until it's really smooth and the dough bounces back. But if I was in a hurry in the morning and I had a few hours to let the dough hang out, this might be the method I would go with now that I understand how much water the dough needs. After coating the dough in a layer of oil to retain all its moisture, I like to let it rest with plastic around it or in Tupperware or covered with a wet towel. So what's the deal with resting anyway? I found resting to be one of the biggest factors in making a good chapati. But what's happening when the dough is resting?
So basically, more and more gluten and gliadin molecules are in the presence of water combining to form gluten, which is that sort of stretchy structure. And when you knead, you're forcing that alignment of the water-hating parts on the outside and the water-loving parts on the inside. If you just let it rest, the whole thing is happening in slow motion by itself, right? So those molecules are slowly just sort of turning. That's all that's happening.
Every video online I found said, oh, just let it rest for 30 minutes. But when I did that, I got a hard chapati. It is winter here and I'm higher up in the mountains, so it's not very warm in my kitchen. So how long do I really need to let the dough rest for?
The longer it rests, the softer it's going to be, the more pliable it's actually going to be. So I guess it varies by the dish that you're trying to make and the ambient temperature. It tends to be structurally stronger, especially if you're making like aloo parathas and you want to stuff. The risk with letting chapati doughs, etc., rest for that long is the fact that the dough will dry out. Okay? And they avoid that for the Malabar paratha because it's just coated in fat. So Malabar parathas in general are actually rested for several hours. If you go to a street chat shop, the guy will come in the afternoon and knead the dough and let it rest till pretty much the late night. Sometimes it'll rest for 6-7 hours. And so that gets you this super soft texture and the ability to create layers. And by the way, paratha doughs do better with a 24-hour rest, particularly in the fridge. And again, if you're in the mountains, if it's not like too warm and so on, you might even get away with it at room temperature. I mean, if I rest my chapati dough outside for 3 hours, I'll get sourdough in Chennai. So it's really warm and tropical and so on. Right? So that's clearly, I think, ambient temperature is clearly one consideration.
I found that a minimum of 1 hour works really well for me in my kitchen. But if I have time to let the dough rest for a couple hours, I take advantage of it, as long as the dough is coated in oil and covered really well so there's no moisture loss. The abridged difference between an Indian chapati and a Swahili chapati, or paratha, is the Indian chapati is ready to be rolled out and cooked at this point of the process, whereas the Swahili chapati needs to be rolled out and coated with fat to get those flaky layers incorporated into the dough. This is also a test to see if you rested the dough long enough. If the dough is still springy and really difficult to roll out, I just let it rest a little more. There are a ton of different techniques used at this point, which complicated everything for me. So I narrowed my strategy to this method, and it's worked great for me. First, I roll the dough into a log and cut my pieces. Then roll those into balls or discs. I have a small pan to work with, so I don't go too large on the size of my chapati. I then dust my working space in dough ball and roll it out into a thin circle. I'm not trying for paper thin, like in some other methods. I just want something relatively thin. I then coat the top with fat. My favorites are either a mix of canola oil and ghee or coconut oil. But the point is to spread a light layer of fat on your top layer. I was definitely too generous with oil in the beginning, which would squirt out during the next step, so I learned lighter was better, as long as it spreads over the surface of the dough. Some people like to sprinkle flour on the fat at this stage, but I didn't really find that too necessary, and too much flour gave me this dry flakiness I didn't really care for. I tried a few different rolling techniques, but the one that worked best for me was to roll the dough in a cone and then push the endwards inward. Then I place that end on my work surface and push and twist the head of the cone into the body of the dough. At this stage, I like to cover the dough with plastic or a wet cloth the way they are and let them rest for a few minutes. But if I'm trying to let them rest for a long time, I like to coat them in a little bit of oil to make sure they don't dry out. Too much oil, and they'll collect too much of the dusting flour, which ends up cooking and burning in the pan.
The dusting flour is going to stick to it, and then if you flame grill it, it's going to burn. And the burning actually produces acrylamide and other not so very nice carcinogenic substances that you want to avoid.
The final roll took me a little time to understand. At first, I thought I could just spread out the dough with my fingers and get some decent final results. But what ended up happening was some parts of the chapati would cook more than others, and the inside wouldn't puff up to create those nice layers. So I got a rolling pin and learned that, like with most things, I was not handling it with enough care. Oh my God, it's so beautiful. I was rolling the dough too hard and ended up losing a lot of layers created in the last step because all the fat would just squirt out. So I let the rolling pin do all the work with a gentle pressure from my hands. I found that my ideal chapati was rolled out to about 1/8 of an inch thick. But some people like the chapati a lot thicker.
Within India, you'll find that Gujaratis will make like the insanely, almost nanometer level thin, fulkas that you can eat like 20 of. The Indian army will obviously make chapatis that are pretty thick.
Now we're ready to cook. So this is the easy part, right? We have our perfect chapati. The dough's the right consistency. The layers are really nice inside. It's at the right thickness. We should get the perfect chapati, right? This right here was the biggest reason I sucked at making chapatis. Now, there are varying temperatures advised online, but most of them settled on medium-low. So I took that to mean that my medium burner needed to be on low flame. And I kept doing this for a long time. I'm talking weeks. I couldn't get a decent chapati to save my life. I'm changing the water content. I'm kneading differently. I'm switching flours. I'm letting it rest for 6 days. And still a bad chapati. It was my biggest enemy and I didn't even know it. So what was happening inside that chapati at too low of a temperature?
Same thing, moisture loss. That's what you want to avoid. So the lower the heat, the longer the time you cook, the more moisture you're going to lose. And you don't want that. The trick with the chapati is essentially that you want to gelatinize the starches because otherwise it's just going to taste flowy. And you just want to get, you don't want to lose too much water in the process of cooking that starch. So you want to keep the temperature reasonably high. Okay. What's happening is that any browning happens at temperatures well above 100 Celsius, 110 plus, right? So clearly the outside temperature of the tawa, when it's making contact, that's very high temperature. That's 130, 140 Celsius, right? That's when you get browning. But the inside temperatures need to reach about 70 Celsius for the starches to cook. So it's really hitting that sort of balance. And, it only comes with sort of experimenting and seeing, what really works.
What really worked for me is taking a heavy bottom pan, in this case, a stainless steel skillet, and heating it on high with my medium burner. I let it heat up to the point where it's starting to smoke, and then I lay my chapati down. When the chapati starts to bubble on top, I know it's time to flip it over, and I should start seeing browning occur. That's the cue for our final step, the finishing oil. To finish off the chapati in the pan, you need to fry it in a little bit of oil. Keywords being finish and a little oil. On the finishing end, I was adding the oil a little too early and not clearing the pan of oil after every chapati, which ended up crisping up my chapati too fast. Now, I always wait until my chapati is browned a little bit before adding the oil. Or if I'm not eating the chapati till later, I cook it dry and save the frying portion for when I'm ready to eat, which is great if you're making these for a special event or storing them in the freezer for a late night snack. The amount of oil was also throwing me off. I don't have a brush, so I was laying fat spoonfuls of oil on top of the chapati and then trying to spread it around. But I found that produced too oily of a chapati. So I ended up using a different technique where I would lay the oil in the pan and then spin the chapati around to coat it in the oil. This is my favorite part, and everybody has their preference of whether to do this or not, but I like to beat my chapati up. For the chapati, this serves two purposes. It lets the steam out so it doesn't become too soggy, and also breaks up the stiff bits. If you look at chapati videos online, you'll often see people flexing their chapati prowess by rolling the chapati up. This seems to be the gold standard for a good chapati. Now, no matter how good my chapati was, I found that pretty difficult to achieve. And I found out why. It's because I was making 2 or 3 chapatis at a time, so I would just kind of put them to the side so I could test them later. It wasn't until I made a big batch of chapati and wanted to keep them warm. So I tucked them in with a towel and put them in an enclosure. And what happened? This trapped the heat inside, resulting in a soft and flexible chapati. So whenever you're cooking your chapatis, make sure you're keeping them wrapped up in a towel or in a pot or some sort of enclosure so that they steam a little bit and get a little bit softer. So how are my chapati skills now?
it's a ticket. Talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it.
And it's a ticket. Talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it. A comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it, get it, get it. Comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it. And it's a ticket. Talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it. A comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it, get it, get it. Comma and a comma. Gotta get it. And it's a ticket. Talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it. A comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it, get it, get it. Comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it. And it's a ticket. Talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it. A comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it, get it, get it. Comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it. Ticket talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it. A comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it, get it, get it. Comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it. And it's a ticket talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it. A comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it, get it, get it. Comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it. And it's a ticket talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it. A comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it, get it, get it. Comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it.
Go ahead and share this video with 3 people who you think suck at making chapatis. And if your friend or family member sent this video to you, I'm sorry to break the bad news to you. But good news, you don't have to suck. Next week, I'm gonna continue my quest for the perfect chapati by exploring more advanced techniques of chapati and also exploring what different additives like eggs, milk, baking powder do to the final product. So don't forget to like and subscribe. So go out there and start making your not so shitty chapatis. I'm Shazad. Welcome to the show. Can't you just like follow a recipe or something? A huge thank you to Ashok for getting on a call with me and explaining to me the science behind chapati making. I highly recommend his book, Masala Lab, The Science Behind Indian Cooking. It is the best book on curries, biryanis, breads, no matter what culture you come from. I'll also be releasing that full conversation between Ashok and I. So don't forget to like and subscribe.